Welcome to this author's interview series. My name is Christina Theodoraki. I'm editor of Small Business Economics and Entrepreneurship Journal, and I have the great honor to interview today two amazing scholars in entrepreneurship research, Dean Shepherd from University of Notre in Indiana, and Trent Williams from Indiana University in Bloomington. It is a very great honor for me and also a privilege to talk to you today. So welcome, Dean, welcome, Trent, and thank you very much for participating to this interview series and sharing your knowledge with us today.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
So Dean and Trent are going to give us more insight on their paper entitled Different Response Paths to Organizational Resilience. This paper is published in Small Business Economics recently in October 2022. And I will start my first question. Could you please tell me more about what is the article about? And also, can you please provide us with a definition of what is resilience in general? And in particular, what is organizational resilience?
Trent, maybe I'll start off because the questions might get tougher and then it can be your turn. So resilience, I was talking to some doctoral students recently and they came up with the normal definition of bouncing back. But the actual psychology research really says it's not so much bouncing back, because bouncing back is more like recovery, where you have a dysfunction in your positive functioning, there's a disruption, and then people work their way back. So resilience is really being able to maintain positive functioning in the face of an adverse event or in the face of adversity. So in this case, it would be the pandemic was the adverse event. And we were able to find these organizations that were able to maintain positive functioning despite the fact that there is this adverse event. So I suppose that's the definition, and that's really how we got interested in it, to say there is an objective adverse event, but not everyone experienced it the same way. And even those people who experienced it the same way, people had different responses. And so we were interested in studying, of those that were successful, what were the different paths to their success? And I think that was the basis behind the paper.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think a key thing we were trying to do in this paper that we had been long interested in was taking some of that conceptualization that is in the psychology literature and bringing it to the organization, because in a prior paper we've worked on where we look at different definitions of resilience, it's really all over the board, and it's almost become a ubiquitous term that is losing some of its meaning. And so our goal was to reground some of that meaning in this psychology literature, and then to also couple that with another stream of research that is looked at growth, during a crisis. And so not only are we maintaining functioning, but perhaps even growing in the face of adversity. And so, as Dean was saying, we found these different paths or different ways that people achieve resilience, and in fact, some even achieved growth.
Yeah. So that growth trend, maybe we called it resilience, but maybe it's not resilience, right? Maybe we need to come up with I know Sally Maitlis and other people have looked at, kind of post-traumatic growth. And I suppose it's resilience, but it's in some ways it's more than resilience. And I think that's what our paper tries to show, is that, we just say there's resilient and there's not resilient. And we say, well, there's some more nuance to it than that. Yeah.
Excellent. Can you tell me why this article is important and what we learn more from this paper that we didn't know before? For example, you do the parallel between growth and resilience. We can see probably, is there another perspective, another path we see in something broad that we haven't still defined in the research, that we bring a new way of thinking probably, or discovering phenomenon in entrepreneurship research?
Yeah, I think from my perspective, if those listening actually look at this paper, which we hope you do, and take a look at it in figure 2, is where we elaborate these different pathways. And so for Dean and I, what got us really excited as we were discussing this paper is we said, well, you know, how is resilience measured usually in the clinical psychology literature? Well, it's the absence of PTSD symptoms. And so we thought, well, that's perhaps one of the reasons it doesn't really translate well to an organization is, you know, organizations don't perhaps have PTSD symptoms. I mean, obviously members can have emotional reactions. And so what I think is really unique is if we are trying to figure out like, well, what does resilience actually look like? And so that's a practical outcome there where it's, well, resilience, it could look kind of like this. It could look kind of like that. And so these are these different pathways. So that's the first observation that for us was new compared to what we had seen before. And then also the kind of problem solving and strategic choices that organizations made, given kind of the hand they were dealt. And so, you know, as each organization faced the same challenge, you know, COVID-19 pandemic, it presented very differently. And in fact, one thing that we normally wouldn't see as a challenge was like near exponential growth in demand. Normally that's exciting, except when the supply chains are shut down. And so what we found is these patterns of different strategies or ways that organizations were using their agency to maintain that functioning and perhaps even enhance it a little bit. So yeah, Dean, what were some of your thoughts?
I think I'd just add that when we wrote this paper, we were conscious not to make it a COVID-19 paper, but to use COVID-19 as a context in which to explore resilience. And the other thing that Trent and I have been thinking about for quite a while is if we want to get into these, what we think are interesting questions, then we have to think of a different way of trying to collect data. And so this paper is really, we took the transcripts of the how I built this resilience issue from NPR, and we transcribed it and we coded as secondary data. And while I started to think, hey, this is pretty novel, I found out that Greg Fisher had done something similar on a paper that he did on hustling. So it was good that, you know, we came up with this idea independently of Greg, but noticed that other people are starting to try and think about how do we collect and analyze interesting data in a different way than we have in the past. And so, you know, this paper will obviously have limitations, as all papers do, but I think it's kind of interesting to kind of use data in different ways.
Excellent. And I also see, I have in mind David Odridge, who always tell me that we can see a phenomenon as a concept or as a measurement. And I'm interested to see, you see resilience as both, can be also a concept or also a measurement?
Go ahead, Trent. Did you want to? Well, I think Trent and I have looked at it really more as, is it an event or is it a process? In the way that we try and discuss it. And of course it can be both, but I think in Trent's Academy Management Annals paper, we primarily define it as a process, and he offers it, Trent was instrumental in offering a very strong definition there. Did you want to add something there, Trent?
Yeah, no, I think from that perspective, we have theorized in the past that we have almost like two different kinds of situations. So there are what we might call daily perturbations, daily difficulties that an organization must adapt to and adjust. And that too is resilience in that it's these daily interactions. And then if we are eliminating the threat of a massive crisis within an organization by addressing those, then we don't even notice that we've been resilient. And then, but then there can be either an escalation of those kinds of daily things, as well as these kind of out of the blue punctuating events. And so what we were trying to do there is to capture both the process and event-based idea of a crisis, and then the flip side of that, both the process and event-based response that is resilient from an organizational perspective. And so, yeah, I'm not sure if this is getting at your question about what we're kind of measuring, but I think for us it's always been unique to try and think if we just pair off and only look at how an organization responds to something difficult like the COVID-19 pandemic, well, that's really missing everything. And it could be that this issue has been incubating for quite some time, and then now it just hit its peak. And so that's what a lot of the kind of disaster management scholarship finds, is it's like, no, it's better to look at what preceded this a little bit more. And so in turn, we said, well, then we should also look at the actions organizations engaged in to be resilient.
Yeah, it was a little bit difficult trying to kind of categorize COVID-19. You know, was it an event? Was it a process? Are we in it? Are we out of it? When did it start? You know, was it the virus or was it the shutdown? I mean, it was a lot of uncertainty surrounding what that adversity was. So I think that made it more interesting, but also a little bit more messy.
Let me go back in the past. What motivated this idea? When do you remember the moment you decided to write this paper? What was it? The COVID-19 crisis? Was it another event? Where did this idea came from for this research?
Yeah, I think Trent and I both started this research together quite a long time ago. And we both had slightly different reasons for why we wanted to engage in adversity and resilience research. So I'll tell you mine and then Trent can tell you his. And then I think based on that background, we said, we're in one of these adverse events now. Why don't we try and understand how organizations are adjusting to the current situation? So mine was when I was back in Australia, my auntie Shirley lived on a farm, and she was playing bingo at the local village when a huge firestorm hit country Victoria, and she lost her house and her fences and her dogs and her horses, and she lost everything. And she lived with my parents and never went back to that location again. But when Trent and I first started studying that situation, we found that a lot of locals created these ventures in order to be able to help other people overcome the adversity. So these individuals were resilient and they contributed to a community that was resilient to adversity. And so Trent and I worked on that for a couple of papers. And then Trent has his own story about what motivated him on resilience.
Yeah, well, I got really excited when I arrived on campus here, not too far from where I'm sitting right now, and realized that I could perhaps study some things that had been really interesting to me. You know, growing up, I grew up in a family where my grandfather was in the Air Force, and he became known as the Berlin candy bomber. And so, for those who aren't familiar, after World War II, the city of Berlin was blockaded, and there was an airlift that was initiated. And I was always fascinated with this airlift because, you know, here you had human life on the line, and there were all of these really fascinating, honestly, outcasts in the US military. One person who was really interested in air cargo, which people said that'll never be a thing. Like, we have trains, we don't need airplanes. So he was off somewhere in a foreign country. Another guy was working a desk in DC. My grandfather was flying airplanes to and from Brazil. And these individuals were brought together and really through a lot of ingenuity and creativity and somewhat spontaneous organizing, they began pulling off delivering food and water to the Berliners. And, you know, my grandpa, being an extremely curious human being, when he was done with his 16-hour flight during the day, he of course took his video camera, which I have no idea how he had one of those in the 1940s, and went and took a film of the people who were, especially the children who were right along the fence, trying to see the planes and trying to have a glimpse of somebody. Long and short of it is he was about to walk away, and he gave these two kids 2 sticks of gum, and he felt like he was going to get mobbed and they were going to beat each other up. Instead, they tore it into small little pieces. They tore the wrappers. Everybody was sniffing the wrappers, and he was so touched. He said, well, I'm going to bring some candy back the next day. And so he did. He came back the next day, and he wiggled his wings so they knew it was him, and threw a parachute out with some candy on it. And he nearly got kicked out of the military as a result. but instead they turned it into a full-fledged operation. And so for me, that was always fascinating to me. There are so many concepts within that story. And as Dean and I met and began investigating this data from his home state in Australia and connecting some of my experiences, it's just been a delightful partnership to investigate many different aspects of these two different stories that we've enjoyed studying and telling together.
Can you please tell me, where do you see the future path of resilience? Where the research is going? What are the next steps? What do you see? What you want you to see in future research on this topic?
Yeah. Well, hopefully it's some of the work that I'm working on now. You hope that that's going to be a little bit of the future and stuff that Trent's doing. So what I did was, the work that I did with Trent was mainly about events, adverse events that hit, and how do entrepreneurs respond. And some of the more recent research that I've been doing is really on chronic adversity. So people that are put into an adverse situation that have been in it for an extended period of time, how does entrepreneurship help them find their way and have a more, a better life, despite the fact that they live in this chronic adversity? So how do they find a way to kind of a better life? And I think that's the main area that I'm looking at the moment.
Yeah, no, and I think I've been interested in this across levels of analysis as well. So some of the other work both Dean and I have done is looking at how do individuals sort through the very narrow personal challenges that they have, and could entrepreneurship or organizing be a mechanism to help them find a new way? And then, yeah, I think for me, I continue to be very interested in these circumstances that from my kind of Western perspective seem very extraordinary. I mean, almost impossible. And yet people are continuing to operate, to run organizations in contexts that are very difficult. And I think that is perhaps challenging some of the assumptions I have about the different concepts that we've talked about briefly here, and trying to understand what do these different concepts reveal about the human condition. And so I think we're all, probably about 7 or 8 years ago, Dean and I had a difficult time conveying to people that organizing under crises was really important. We have less difficulty since 2020 making that argument. But I think the final thing I'll say is, just as we explore some of these other contexts outside of the US, outside of Europe, some of these other locations, hopefully they expand a number of our theories, including, but not limited to, resilience.
Can you please tell me how we can best apply your findings, and what would be your suggestions or advice to best implement some of your findings for practitioners to best use your findings?
Yeah, I mean, I can start there. I mean, I guess I'll come back to where I was talking about some of these problem framing that we have in our model, different types of problem frames, different types of strategic responses, and different types of what we call operational enactment, ways that they actually enacted some of these ideas that they were doing. And so the first thing would be, when organizations are facing challenges, perhaps don't try to copy a model that's right next to you. There could be a lot of different choice sets that you have. And then I think try and align what you have available to you with the appropriate choice set. If you're trying to do a full-scale restructuring, where it's probably better to do some smaller adjustments, it's not necessarily wise. So I don't know. I just felt, I personally felt like these choice sets were really interesting in somewhat combining some concepts in strategic management with crisis and with resilience.
Great answer.
Perfect. Coming to the end of this interview series, I would like personally to thank you very, very much for sharing with me and with our audience today your insights on your research, describing more about your finding and your suggestions. I don't know if you have any last comments or advices for the persons that who are going to read your article, how to best read it, or what you advise. We'll close with that. For my point of view, I would like to thank you again for building all these bases for resilience for the next generations, also for continue to do research on these important topics. And also, I would like to encourage our readers to download your paper, because it's also in open access, so they can freely download from the website of Springer. And closing this interview, I would like to know if you have any last comments for our audience.
Okay, sure. No, I guess I just as I reflect on something, and thank you for the opportunity to chat. I'm just full of appreciation for, I mean, lots of the different people who have worked on this topic, and we've built on a lot of amazing work. We've mentioned people here in this conversation, but there are others, and so I think it's exciting to see people build off of one another in that process. The second thing I'd just say is, Dean and I have taken risks in exploring topics at times that seemed to be outside the norm, and yet it's been extremely fun and exciting to do research in this kind of domain, and it's not difficult for me to say, well, how might this matter for an actual human being? And that's essential, I think, for us as researchers to, whatever it is that our skill set is, whatever type of methodology, really trying to not forget the subject that we're exploring, and to connect with that individual through our work, but also to try and speak to them in terms of some useful outputs, as you've been pushing us to discuss today. So I guess I would just continue to encourage us here and those listening to keep pushing in this domain, and we thank you for your contributions.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Trent. I'll just build on that a little bit. I suppose as entrepreneurship scholars, we need to be resilient ourselves, right? So despite the adversity of reviewers and editors rejecting our research, I mean, we have to just keep plugging away on research that you think is important, and then you hope that eventually it'll lead to a good outcome. And also, I suppose, just being novel in methods. You open yourself up to criticism when you're novel in methods, because it's not perfect. But at least we get to answer and ask more interesting research questions, I think, and we're happy to kind of take that risk.
I would like to thank you both because you have beautifully said that sometimes we need to focus on the topics that are interest of us, sometimes can be outside of the norm. But if we go back some years ago, entrepreneurship research could be considered outside of the norms. And we need also to, as entrepreneurship journal, also take some risk to explore what is happening to the society today. And also, I would say that we open discussions and continue to think to explore the new avenues. Thank you again for your inspiring discussion today. It's a really pleasure and honor and privilege for me to discuss with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Christina.
Yeah, thank you.